Good day, everyone, and welcome to our fourth webinar in a 9-part webinar series on wind energy and wildlife. Today's webinar is focused on methodologies and technologies used to study the impacts of wind turbines on bats. And before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you are having any issues with your computer audio, there's the option to call in with your phone. If audio issues persist or you have issues with the webinar, we recommend going to the support website listed on the screen or the numbers that are provided here. For this webinar and for all within the series, we ask everyone to assume positive or good intent in the dialogue and presentations. We are bringing in a number of stakeholders and perspectives to discuss complex and sensitive issues, but we feel strongly that everybody that's involved with this is really enthusiastic, energetic, trying to reach common ground and achieve common goals. We'd also like you to engage with the speakers. We do have a couple of trivia questions throughout the presentation to just kind of break up the talks, but also you can use the question feature on the webinar to ask questions of our presenters, and we'll have time at the end for a Q&A session, and any questions we don't get to, we can also follow up in writing for those. For more information on bats and wind energy or wind energy and wildlife, we encourage everyone to visit the TETHIS website, tethis.pnnl.gov. Here you can use the knowledge base to do literature review. There's an events calendar. And you can also sign up for TETHIS Blasts, which is a bi-weekly newsletter that provides news on calendar events and new literature. Looking ahead at the rest of our webinar topics, we've got 5 more after this one. The date and time are set for the 5th webinar, which is on eagles. This will be on September 29th. Between 12 and 2 Eastern time. And we're very close to setting the schedules for the remaining ones, and we'll announce those soon. Okay, with that, I want to introduce our speakers. My name is Chris Hine. I'm a senior project leader for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'll be moderating this webinar and also giving a brief overview on the issue of bats and wind energy. And then we have a wonderful list of experts who collectively have decades of studying, monitoring, and partnering on wind energy research projects. Following me will be Trevor Peterson, who will speak more to using acoustic data and analyses to assess risk. Then Sarah Weaver, who will speak to post-construction mortality methodologies and lessons learned. Sarah will be followed by Amanda Hale, who will speak about collecting additional data from carcasses, such as tissue samples, to do genetics or genomic analyses. And then our last speaker is Matt Becker, who will provide an industry perspective and lessons learned on collaborating on, conducting monitoring and research projects at proposed and operational wind energy facilities. So with that, before I get into my presentation, just wanted to have a trivia question for the audience. And the question to start off with is, what is the estimated value of bats to the U.S. agricultural industry? Bats eat tons of insects each night, including many agricultural pests. So is the answer A, $45 million per year, B, $850 million per year, C, $23 billion per year, or D, there's no economic value because all bats are vampire bats and drink blood?
Chris, it looks like our top answer is C, $23 billion per year. 50% of people have voted for that.
Great, we got a smart group. All right, so moving on. I don't know if that is showing up. So what I would like to do is start off with kind of looking at events or publications over time, overlaid on top of the installed wind energy capacity from 2000 to 2020. So this figure shows the annual capacity between that time period, and then the line is the cumulative capacity over the 20 years. So you can see that we've gone from about 2,500 megawatts to over or about 110,000 megawatts in the 20 years. And although bat fatalities were reported around the world at wind energy facilities, it really didn't become much of a concern until about 2004, when a site in the Appalachian forested range of the mid-Atlantic estimated thousands of bat fatalities in one fall season. And this initiated or spurred the development of the Batson Wind Energy Cooperative, which is a collection of stakeholders with a goal of developing and disseminating measures to monitor or mitigate bat fatalities at wind energy facilities. The following year, a study was conducted at a couple of wind energy sites that really set the stage for a lot of the work that continued on. We got a lot of information on the patterns of bat fatalities that have held true over time, and has really kind of spurred some of the additional research and monitoring efforts. Some of that information helped inform the first U.S.-based blanket curtailment study, which was started in 2008. Also at this time, one of the first studies using thermal video cameras to observe bat behavior at wind turbines was published. In 2009, the first study using ultrasonic deterrence at an operational wind energy facility was started. In 2013, several studies looked at multiple facilities to try and develop cumulative estimates for bat fatalities across the U.S. or the U.S. and Canada. They were all based on different assumptions, different sets of data, and had different biases, but they all pointed to hundreds of thousands of fatalities of bats in the U.S. and in Canada. In 2015, the Department of Energy kind of reinvigorated the investigations of using deterrent technologies for reducing bat fatalities through a funding opportunity announcement. There had been a bit of a lag since that first study that I pointed out that started in 2009. Also, the American Wind Energy Association announced their best management practice, which calls for the feathering of wind turbine blades up to the manufacturer's cut-in speed. In 2017, a group of experts used their wealth of information and experience to come up with their take on population estimates for hoary bats, population growth rate, in combination with a static fatality rate based on data collected prior to 2014 to develop a model or series of models looking at the impact of wind turbines on hoary bats out to the future. And this study, based on these assumptions, showed that 90% of hoary bat populations would decline if by 2050, given those set of conditions. The next year, the Department of Energy had another funding opportunity announcement geared towards minimization strategies, both for the use of deterrent technologies and for smart curtailment strategies. Also this year, the Wind and Wildlife Research Fund was initiated to also spur kind of research and development on questions that still persist. And then the last thing that I'll highlight here is in 2019, the first publication using real-time bat activity to inform curtailment decisions was published. So you can imagine there's a whole bunch of information that you could populate this figure with, but what I tried to do here is just put several of the firsts that have kind of spurred additional research to help with our understanding. So where does all this data come from? We need a lot of different methodologies and technologies to answer various questions. This list is by no means exhaustive. But in the pre-construction stage of development, the workhorse has been the use of acoustic detectors to understand bat activity, presence, patterns of activity such as seasonality and weather conditions when bats are more or less active. In the post-construction setting, our data predominantly comes from mortality monitoring and has provided a wealth of information, but in some respects can be limited. And we can use thermal video cameras or acoustic detectors to get more precise information on when bats are interacting with wind turbines. Also, when recovering carcasses during mortality studies, you can collect tissue samples and run additional analyses to help answer questions about how bats are moving across the landscape and kind of broad patterns, or look at genetic type questions. And certainly there are other tools that can be used either in pre or post-construction settings, or not even related to a project site. Radio tracking and GPS tags are an example that aren't commonly used in wind energy studies, but can provide information on how bats are using the landscape that might inform our decisions. Radar is another tool, as well as cave surveys and mist netting. So we've learned a lot over the past 16 or so years, but there's still a lot of uncertainty and gaps to fill. So I'm hedging a little bit, and we'll say that these are the things that we know-ish, that we have some level of confidence in, but additional data can help refine or hone in on some of these questions. So based on the studies that have looked at cumulative fatality rates, they've estimated hundreds of thousands of fatalities, bat fatalities per year. These fatalities come from 27 species, but the most that have been reported come from 4 species, 3 of which we commonly call migratory tree-roosting bats, the hoary bat, the eastern red bat, and silver-haired bat, and also another migratory species, the Brazilian free-tailed bat, can make up a large percentage of fatalities within its range. And those species we kind of have to deal with separately because they don't have any sort of regulatory status. We do have, to a much lower degree, fatalities of species that are state or federally listed. And so there are laws that we have to adhere to for these individual fatalities, and the Indiana bat, northern long-eared bat, and Hawaiian hoary bat are examples. There are also fatalities of species that have been impacted by white nose syndrome that we might be concerned about, such as the little brown bat and tricolored bat. And why we're concerned, and what makes this even more complicated, is that we don't have an understanding of how many bats are on the landscape, at least for many species. But we do know that bats have a low reproductive rate. They're long-lived animals, and tend to only have 1 to 2 pups per year. So large-scale or long-lasting impacts can take a toll on populations and take a long time for populations to recover. Now, some of the cave roosting species where cave counts are done on a periodic basis have provided a level of information on populations. But for these tree roosting species or migratory species, we know very little. And that makes it difficult to contextualize the impacts. We don't know if our current level of fatality is sustainable or will be sustainable in the future. And that also makes it difficult to determine what level of minimization, if necessary, is needed. And so really complex and challenging questions, one, to understand bat populations and then to put it in the context with this particular issue. And in lieu of getting population estimates that are more precise than what we currently have, we need to build a weight of evidence using as many data sources as possible. This could include acoustic surveys that are part of the North American Bat Monitoring Program, genomic and genetic research, accounts of rabies records over time, misnet captures, all to give us a sense of, are bat populations stable? Are they increasing, decreasing? And if so, by how much? Another factor that complicates this is it appears that at least for some species, bats or individuals are interested in the wind turbines or the area, or maybe at a broader landscape scale, the wind energy facilities, and we're not entirely sure why. We do see bats spending a lot of time around wind turbines, investigating different parts, the blades, nacelle, towers, flying in and out of the rotor swept area. But we're unsure as to what is kind of bringing them in or what's interesting for them. It may be that they view wind turbines as a resource, or there's something about the surrounding habitat or landscape that's of interest. And given all the other variability we see in this issue, it's likely that potential attraction varies by species, by the surrounding conditions, or some combination. So it's likely not a one-size-fits-all. But if we had this information, we could easily, it might help us help us with finding better solutions or more cost-effective solutions. On our 7th webinar coming up in a few weeks, we'll dive in more on minimization strategies, but I did want to provide some context because it relates to the patterns and what we've observed over the last 16 years. So what we've seen, for the most part, there are variations, but what we've seen is that bat mortality tends to occur in late summer and early fall. It's only at night when bats are active and under relatively low wind speed conditions. And this is actually very fortunate for us. This, in and of itself, has helped narrow down the time when we might curtail wind turbines. And based on this information alone, we've tested a number of curtailment strategies, and this is often termed blanket curtailment, and it's shown to be successful. However, there are times when turbines are curtailed when bats are not at risk, and so we can look at other weather variables that might be important to help refine the strategy, or use modeled or real-time bat activity to inform curtailment decisions. And the addition of bat activity or other variables is commonly referred to as smart curtailment. Either of these strategies results in a loss of revenue and power generation, and we don't want that. We want to protect bats. We want to produce renewable energy, and so we need to do what we can to try to refine this type of minimization strategy so that it's palatable for all stakeholders. And lastly, just to kind of introduce another set of minimization strategies that are being investigated. Here we're using technologies for the most part to keep bats away from wind turbines and to kind of discourage their investigation. So most of this work has fallen under studies looking at the effectiveness of ultrasonic deterrence, but there are other ways of kind of dissuading bats from approaching or spending time around turbines, such as dim UV light or coating turbine towers. Here, there are complications with these types of strategies as well. We're dealing with technology and integration issues. How effective are they? And there are costs associated with, studying these technologies and implementing them as well. So I'll end there and appreciate your time listening to that presentation, and then hand it over to Trevor Peterson, who will get more into analyzing acoustic data and risk to bats. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you much. I will get this sharing here. All right. Can you see that?
Trevor,
that's in.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Shana. It's in the presenter mode, so
I see.
Just
okay.
Change the display settings.
Yep. Okay.
Looks great.
Excellent. Well, thank you much. I appreciate the opportunity to present here. And what I'll talk about is focusing on acoustic monitoring and sort of what it does well, what it maybe it doesn't do so well, and what I think we could be using, or the wind industry and regulatory community could be using acoustics for, and should be using the technology for, as we move forward in trying to predict, avoid, manage the risk that installed wind turbines pose to bats. So I'll focus on three large categories. First of all, what is bat activity? I think a lot of us, the term bat activity gets thrown around a lot and used a lot, and it can mean different things in different contexts. And I think it's important to take a little bit of a dive into what bat activity really is. Second, I'll quickly go through existing knowledge on whether bat activity, as defined above, does in fact predict risk. And then lastly, make recommendations of what I think the technology can do best, and how we should be and how we could be using it as an industry. So first of all, what is bat activity, acoustic bat activity? It wasn't until the mid-1950s when Donald Griffin, pictured here, discovered echolocation in bats. Prior to that, people thought that bats use some sort of sense of touch to navigate and avoid obstacles. He was the first to show that, in fact, they're using echolocation in the ultrasonic frequency range to not only fly and avoid obstacles, but to also capture prey. And so by sending out these high frequency pulses, they're able to record the echolocations and get around in complete darkness. It's a phenomenal sense, and we're only scratching the surface as to how bats are able to actually use echolocation. But what echolocation enables us to do is listen in on bats and learn quite a lot about activity patterns, species composition, in other words, what bats are present in an area, and a little bit about what they're doing there. So some of the ways acoustic bat activity can be defined, in its simplest terms, acoustic bat activity is the detection of a bat during a particular moment within the range of that detector. Echolocation is phenomenally good for bats to see the world around them, but it doesn't travel very far. The physics of sound mean that ultrasonic frequencies only go a relatively short distance, and they're quickly attenuated by moisture in the air and other factors, and they simply lose energy quickly. So a bat detector is really only able to monitor activity within maybe a 30-meter distance at the most. And this, of course, varies with species and varies tremendously with conditions. So in the simplest terms, again, bat activity is a bat flying past a detector and being recorded. You can aggregate this data, of course, and create an index, a quantitative metric of how frequently bats pass by that detector. So you're now coming up with a measurable rate of activity. Importantly, well, I'll get into that later. It doesn't necessarily indicate how many bats, but you can tell with precision when a bat passes that detector and aggregate that information. You can also pretty accurately identify species based on the characteristics of the recorded echolocation pass. This gets complicated. Over on the right, you can see a single pass that, in this case, the Sonobat software is saying it's could be an Indiana bat or could be a little brown bat. Obviously, for the implications of one or the other can be profound for a project. So there's a limited ability for certain species to differentiate with acoustics. But overall, it does provide a pretty good indication of the species composition of bats in an area. And then as we're getting down towards the less certain area, if you look at this scale of more certain and less certain, acoustics provides some indication of how many bats are present in an area, but it's very difficult to actually quantify numbers of bats acoustically. And then lastly, you can learn something about how bats are using an area, as in, are they foraging, are they simply passing through? Although this gets quite difficult to tease these behaviors out precisely using acoustics. So, these are only 5 of many potential things that you could derive from acoustic data, but I think it's really important to keep in the back of your mind which of these are certain and which of these are less certain. So again, when you detect a bat, you know very well that a bat is there in a precise area at a precise time. Beyond that, things get a little less certain. So for years now, wind companies and their consultants and other people have been monitoring bat activity with the idea that the amount of bat activity you record in an area will tell you something about risk. To paraphrase, I think the general thinking about this is that if you use acoustic detectors, you can identify areas with a lot of bat activity and theoretically avoid them, not develop those areas, instead select areas with less bat activity. And while that sounds good, it's proven to be a nearly impossible task, and I don't think anybody has really figured out how to do this. And this isn't necessarily the only thing people are trying to do with acoustics, but it's a large part of what I think the reasoning behind collecting passive acoustic data prior to developing a wind project. Increasingly now, acoustics are also being used to document rare species presence, specifically Indiana bat, northern long-eared bat presence. And that may be a little bit more of a straightforward process, although, as I already mentioned, species composition can be difficult to tease out for those two. So I'll be really quick about this one. The headline, or not the headline, the title of this paper really says it all. This was a recent paper by Don Solik, the title of which is Bat Activity Rates Do Not Predict Bat Fatality Rates at Wind Energy Facilities. So we can check that one off the list. But I think this deserves a little bit more of a deeper dive into what this question is really asking and whether it's the right question. Again, if you're using the amount of bat activity measured pre-construction as a potential indication of risk, what you're really trying to do with the acoustic data is assess how many bats are in an area. And remember from a few slides ago that that's one of the least certain aspects of acoustic data. So there's a lot of factors confounding how many bats you might record at a given bat detector. And considering that most of these pre-construction assessments used anywhere from 2 to 3 to maximum of half a dozen bat detectors, you're really trying to make an inference over a very large area based on a very small amount of space that you're really monitoring. So there are other aspects of risk and fatality patterns at wind energy facilities that acoustics actually predicts very well. So for example, the seasonal signal of when you find your fatalities concentrated in the late summer and the fall is actually predicted very closely with the seasonal patterns measured in most passive acoustic surveys. And also to some extent, the species composition of bats recorded in the rotor swept area, so in other words, in high Met towers, is generally pretty closely aligned with fatality patterns. So you see a very pronounced difference in the species composition of bats recorded above canopy versus those at ground level. So again, this gets into something that acoustics does better is the seasonal and the species composition aspects. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's no value in pre-construction surveys, but it's clear that pre-construction surveys focusing on the number of bats recorded are not telling us what we need to avoid areas with high risk. Even it might be questionable whether that's even possible given the geographic extent of bats and how much they move. It doesn't seem that there are too many places, any places really in North America, that you can safely build a wind farm without any concern over potential impacts to bats. There are obviously, there's certainly regional patterns in where fatality rates are higher and lower, but there are by no means data available now to suggest that there are places without activity of bats. So if bat activity doesn't tell us anything about risk, or it doesn't tell us what we thought we would like to know about risk, what should we be doing with acoustic data? And I think a better goal, or a more feasible goal, might be to use acoustics to generate meaningful information to avoid and manage risk. So to acknowledge that bats are widely distributed and present in most areas where wind projects are planned, and use the information in a different way to manage risk instead of to try to avoid it. So risk, importantly, when it comes to bats, is a highly dynamic process itself, as are the bat's behavior. And the reason that curtailment works, as Chris alluded to previously, is because turbines that are not rotating are thought to pose no risk to bats. So in other words, by turning a turbine off, by curtailing it, you take away risk. And this has profound implications for how we think about risk, because it turns out a lot of bat activity occurs at very low wind speeds when bats are simply not active. And so what we found in some of the work that I've done in several wind projects in West Virginia, where baseline fatality rates for bats are very high, is that if you look only at the subset of bat activity that occurs when a turbine is on, you actually see a very different picture. So these graphs, essentially, it's a pair of scatter plots that show the relationship between the amount of bat activity measured on the x-axis, measured at nacelle height, and the corresponding fatality rate on the y-axis for a series of different operational programs. Some of these are fully operational control turbines, some are curtailed at different rates. The left figure shows the relationship between all bat activity and fatality, which essentially there is no relationship. And the right figure shows you only the subset of bat activity occurring when the turbines were on. And in this case, the picture changes considerably. These again are the same exact data points, simply with the unexposed bat activity removed. And so what I think is going on here is that risk depends on turbine operation. And so therefore, bat activity that's occurring when turbines are off really has no bearing on risk. And what this again gets back to is the fact that while we don't know exactly how many bats are active, acoustics is very good at telling us when bat activity occurs. When it's on top of a turbine, you also know what the wind speed is, you know what the temperature is, among other factors. And most importantly, you know whether the turbine is on. Of course, turbines are designed to respond to wind, and so it's also very easy to predict when a turbine would be on or off under a different curtailment strategy. So what I think a very useful application for acoustic data with this information is to use what we know about bat activity to manage risk. We know that curtailment works. We also know that it's not very popular because it results directly in, it's the opposite of why a wind farm is built. So you're taking away the ability to generate power, but at the same time, you're protecting bat activity. So where I think acoustics has great potential, not only to manage risk at an installed existing project, but to also tell us something about what risk might look like during pre-construction, is to focus not on the number of bat calls you record, but on when they occur and what the weather is like when those bats are recorded. So with this information, you can determine the relationships with weather, how bats are affected by changing temperature, changing wind speed, and specifically what amount of bat activity would be exposed to turbine operation under different scenarios. And this is really where I think there's great potential. We know curtailment works, but I think we need to get beyond the discussions of curtailment in terms of a specific cut-in speed and instead focus on what's our goal as far as reducing risk. With that information, you can take acoustic data and say, how high would we have to increase the cut-in speed in order to reduce exposure of bad activity by, say, 50% or 75%? And that opens the door to a much more strategic approach to curtailment, where you can look at the changing conditions and weather patterns at a site, as well as seasonal patterns in bad activity, and predict how hard it would be, how expensive it would be to reduce exposure by a targeted amount. So again, I think at this point we can define smart curtailment very broadly and say it simply is a way of incorporating site-specific information on bad activity to tailor curtailment strategies. So this is where I think acoustics can be used in a new way if the topic of curtailment is on the table. If a company that's building a wind project is either willing or under the obligation to reduce risk to bats by a certain amount, they can collect pre-construction data using many of the same methods that we're currently using. But instead of getting stuck looking at the number of calls per night or the number of calls per hour, we can instead look at what proportion of that bad activity across the whole year would be exposed to turbine operation in the absence of curtailment, and by how much can you reduce that exposure with some combination of cut-in speeds. So this is really a strategic application that takes advantage of what acoustics does best. Ultimately, I mean, this isn't not a focus on curtailment per se, but this information will help reduce the cost of curtailment, potentially to encourage broader application. So in terms of recommendations, again, I think pre-construction data still has potential value, particularly if it's conducted as high above the ground as possible, and specifically if it's used to predict the potential benefit and cost of curtailment. Instead of saying, no, this is a high-risk site, we can't build there, the conversation would then become, this is a high-risk site because it's in a region with known fatality rates that are high. How hard will it be to avoid these rates? And is this something that might be economically feasible for the project? So it avoids the situation of building a project and then realizing after the fact that it's too difficult potentially to avoid risk or to reduce risk by an appropriate margin. But it also may open the door to having a much lesser amount of curtailment in situations where there's not a lot of bad activity occurring at higher wind speeds. And again, it allows the simulation of cost ahead of time rather than waiting until, once the project is built and obligated to generate a certain amount of power. For existing projects, wind turbines themselves are a perfect platform on which to deploy acoustic detectors. And this data, I think, is the most straightforward information needed to optimize curtailment plans, to design site-specific protocols that will reduce risk by a predictable margin. A lot of times, there's admittedly a lot of uncertainty as to how different types of turbines may affect bats, whether there's attraction and how much attraction is going on, and by how much we need to reduce risk. But the nice thing with acoustics is that you can very directly measure the amount of bad activity that is currently being exposed to turbine operation, and again, figure out what methods are needed to address that risk. In some cases, let's say bats are actually flying at very high wind speeds, that might point you in the direction of something like a deterrent technology as opposed to curtailment, which may be more appropriate if these data show that the preponderance of bad activity is happening when it's very calm. So I think acoustics is by no means meaningless, and I think there's a lot of potential to use acoustics and really to not even change the methods of data collection. But what I think we really need to do is change the way we use the data and how we analyze data to look at a much finer scale as to what this information tells us about how bats are using the airspace and what that tells us in turn about how risk can be modified and reduced. And I'll stop there and hopefully leave plenty of time for questions later. I think we're saving questions till the end, so I believe I will pass the torch to Sarah.
Okay, let's see if I can make this work appropriately. Okay, I think that's working. All right, thank you, Trevor and Chris, and thank you all for joining. I'll be discussing post-construction monitoring methods for BATs at land-based wind energy facilities. But first, I am going to read to you a trivia question. So the question here is, what is the age of the oldest wild bat ever documented? A, 15 years, B, 21 years, C, 32 years, or D, 41 years?
Sarah, it looks like the winning answer so far is C, 32 years with 43% of the vote.
Okay, so then I stumped y'all. The answer is actually D, it's 41 years. A Brandt's bat in Russia was banded in 1964 and was recaptured in 2005. Absolutely crazy, right? Love that question. I am going to stop sharing my camera during this because I've learned the hard way that my system doesn't work as well when my video is on. So I will turn it back on for y'all when we get to the Q&A session. Okay, so as an overview, I plan to highlight the reasons why a facility might be interested in monitoring bat fatalities. Then I plan to discuss the various considerations for a site when designing a study, and finish by highlighting some common questions and issues that can arise during these efforts. But first, why might a facility be interested in monitoring bat fatalities at all? The vast majority of sites do so in order to estimate bat fatality rates for due diligence and to follow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's wind energy guidelines for Tier 4A studies. Others might have requirements to conduct studies because they have an incidental take permit for federally listed species, such as the Indiana bat, and yet others monitor because they are conducting Tier 5 research studies, such as testing the effectiveness of an impact reduction strategy. But study design considerations will vary based on which of these is the reason. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on the first here on due diligence. However, much of what I discuss can apply also to incidental take permits as well as Tier 5 studies. So estimating bat fatalities at wind energy facilities is complicated, and there are many points to consider when designing a study. One of the first questions is, what spatial coverage do you want, or how many turbines will you want to sample, as well as what the search area under a turbine should be. Frequency of search effort, will you want to search turbines daily, every 3 days, weekly, and so on. Duration, should you restrict sampling to just spring through fall, or a year-round effort. And once you've answered these questions and are ready to start sampling, you might consider whether or not you want to use a dog and handler team or human searchers, and what data should you collect during your searches. Then there is how to account for imperfect detection through bias trials and determining proportion of total fatalities expected to fall in your search areas, which is also known as density weighted proportion. And lastly, what estimator or estimators will you use to calculate your fatality estimates? Now, due to time, I am not going to cover density weighted proportion or estimators today, but I will touch on a few comments regarding estimators towards the end. So as with every project, we are constricted by our budgets. So sometimes it's a balancing act of trying to ensure that you are searching enough to get an accurate estimate while not having such a large effort that it isn't economically feasible. One of the decisions on spatial coverage is how many turbines to search. And the recommendations that were put forth by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the wind energy guidelines are that if you have less than 10 turbines, then search them all. But if you have 10 or more, you'd want to search the highest proportion possible. But for facilities that have hundreds of turbines, most often the minimum number of turbines searched is 33%. However, these recommendations were put forward back when most people were searching full plots only, which take a lot more effort and time, and so fewer turbines were able to be searched. These days, most facilities search roads and pads at a certain number of turbines, which take less time, and therefore more turbines can be searched. Turbine selection should be random, but it should ensure that all habitat types are represented. If you decide to search full plots, then plot size is also an important consideration. And for bats, the service recommends a square plot of 120 meters centered on the turbine. But as turbine sizes have gotten larger, this might not be adequate. So I recommend consulting with the agencies as well as experts for the specific type of turbine model that you have at your facility. Next, you'll need to map your search area and include visibility classes present in the search areas, like what is shown here in the figure to the left. Easy visibility is typically going to be true for roads and pads as well as bare ground. And then as ground cover increases, your visibility gets progressively more difficult. This will vary depending upon your site as well. And then finally, you'll want to consider transect spacing for bats, which should be no more than 5 to 6 meters. Bats are very small and they're hard to see, so any wider and you're likely going to miss a lot of carcasses. And that means you'll have low searcher efficiency, which will increase your uncertainty in your estimates. For those that prefer the rope method to transects, this applies to spacing of people on a rope as well. The next considerations are how often to search and during what time of year. With all the time and money in the world, you would want to search all your turbines daily. However, this type of effort is extremely expensive and typically only done in research efforts during Tier 5 studies. For Tier 4A, your efforts for your searches and the frequency should be guided by your carcass persistence times. But in general, you'll want to have a shorter interval or time between searches when carcass persistence is short. The most common frequency that I have seen is weekly searches between spring and fall and every other week during winter. But again, if you have carcasses that don't persist for very long in the landscape, this is going to increase your uncertainty in your estimates. In addition, location matters when you are considering search frequency and duration. And for example, if you're in the northeastern United States where it stays cold during the winter and bats typically hibernate, you may not need to monitor for bats during these times unless you have an incidental take permit that requires it. But in the southwestern United States, where it can be 90 degrees in January and bats are active year-round, then year-round monitoring is likely more appropriate. But often the search interval is increased during winter due to decreased bat fatalities. So now you've answered these questions and you're ready to start your study, and you might be wondering what data are important to have. You'll want to keep records of all search efforts, even when a turbine is not searched, because you'll need your search schedule later for calculating fatality estimates. What about when you find a carcass? What data do you need? Well, everything. And you might be saying, what? What is she talking about? That's ridiculous. How can we record everything? Well, I've provided a typical data sheet here that I use for my studies for us to look at. But there are some standard data to collect on each carcass, such as assigning a unique identifier, time and date of discovery, who found the carcass, the location, as in which turbine it was found at, and the relationship to the turbine, such as the distance and the azimuth, as well as GPS coordinates. The visibility of, as well as the type of substrate around a carcass should be documented so that you can determine your visibility index. In addition, every carcass should have quality photos taken of it before it is handled to confirm the recorded data. And basic information such as species, sex, age, and reproductive status of the bat should be documented if possible. Sometimes carcasses are going to be too desiccated or partially scavenged, and so this isn't always easy to answer. Determining time of death is important as well, and is typically done by documenting the physical condition of carcasses, things such as the pliability of the wings, the presence or absence of an odor, type of insect infestation, as well as condition of the eyes. All these things taken together can help us better estimate time of death. And the speed with which carcasses decompose is very dependent on climate, so I recommend testing this at each site by monitoring the process over time using fresh carcasses that are found during studies. Then you can have a more confident, a higher confidence in your time of death estimates. And this last part of my data sheet is for documenting when tissue, hair, and blood samples are taken, which I highly recommend for reasons that you're going to hear about next in the next presentation. Also, many state agencies are now asking for folks to document if bats have evidence of wing damage from white nose syndrome. So if they ask you to do this, this should be included in the data sheet as well. And then finally, what was done with the carcass should be documented. Was it collected or was it left in place for bias trials? And the best advice that I can give when it comes to data collection is to design your data sheets so that they double and even triple verify information so that when errors occur, you can correct for them. For example, have multiple places to write down turbine number, distance, and azimuth from the turbine, as well as a plot that you can use to compare those two. Okay, so post-construction studies require bias trials to adjust fatality estimates for imperfect detection, which can happen when searchers miss carcasses or when carcasses are removed by scavengers or weather events. And these trials should occur throughout the duration of a study. For searcher efficiency trials, bat carcasses should be placed at random to assess a searcher's ability to find available carcasses. And you can use the bats discovered at the site for these efforts if you have the proper permits in place. And I should have said that before on the last slide too, that if you are going to be handling bats, it does require permits from the state typically, such as salvage permits, and you'll want to have a good safety protocol in place. And for federal species, those often require federal permits as well. For searcher trials, they should be blind, meaning that the searchers are unaware of when or where they are occurring. You'll want to be sure to test every searcher multiple times and in every visibility class and season if you suspect that these might be influencing a searcher's ability to detect a carcass. If a searcher misses a carcass, you'll want to go back and confirm that it was still there for them to find and that it hadn't been removed by a scavenger. But when a carcass is missed, leave it in place for them to have the opportunity to find it on future searches. And this will allow you to estimate the change in searcher efficiency on subsequent searches. And when it comes to planning for how many trials you'll need to run, this is very difficult to state because it depends on a lot of factors. But my advice is always to plan for more than you anticipate because scavengers and weather are inevitably going to interfere with your plans. And I want to note that searcher efficiency trials also apply to dog handler teams, which often have the highest searcher efficiency rates, but they can sometimes be more expensive than using people. And carcass persistence trials are much like searcher efficiency and often use the same carcasses from those efforts. I recommend checking carcasses for persistence daily if possible, but that's not always the case, especially when you might be conducting searches every other week. So check them as often as you can and mark whether they are present or absent. Always be sure to document the exact time that you placed them for the trial, as well as the exact time that you discover that they are absent, not just the date, because this is going to help you to reduce uncertainty in your estimates later on as well. And then lastly, don't overseed the turbines with too many trial carcasses at one time. If there are more carcasses at a turbine than would naturally occur during your study, then this could potentially draw in scavengers and possibly bias your results. Well, I don't have time to go into too much detail on estimators. I do want to highlight a few items when choosing which to use. You should always be striving for the most accurate and precise estimate possible. And the types of data that you'll need include the raw carcass data, searcher efficiency and carcass persistence trials, search schedule, and your density weighted proportions for each turbine. As with any models, junk in, junk out. And that just basically means that if you use poorly collected data to estimate fatalities, you will get an unreliable estimate. So make sure you are hiring folks that know what they are doing and consider quality of work along with budgets. If you're interested in estimators, they will be discussed in webinar 6, so be sure to register for that. And I want to end by discussing some common issues or concerns with these types of studies. There is a human element here, so there's always going to be human errors. And these are the most common problems. Having a rigorous quality assurance and control process is important because of errors on data sheets that I already discussed. Species, sex, and age determinations can be difficult in the field for a variety of reasons. Project teams should always be okay with saying unknown in these cases. But there are easy ways to later confirm species and sex that Amanda Hale will talk about next. We are also finding bats in places outside of their known ranges, and this has important implications when teams are deciding what species are likely to not occur at their site. And one of my biggest pet peeves is blurry or bad photos, like this one here. And while this person did put a ruler in the photo, which is a must, you always need a type of measurement in your photos of carcasses. It's too blurry to read the units and the lines, and the shadow definitely isn't helping either. Also, if you're asking someone else to do species identifications from a photo, there are certain morphological features that an expert will need to be able to see to have confidence in their identifications. Things such as the face and the ears, as well as the tail membrane. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to take good photos. Review them in the field before you handle the carcasses. And also include a note card or a page that has a unique identifier for each carcass in the photo so that they're easily matched up with the data sheets later. That's something that this photo is also lacking. I want to say too that you should be flexible during your study and willing to adjust if necessary. Just as one example, if your searcher efficiency rates are low, you might want to retrain your crew or ask them to slow down their efforts. Another problem is with technology. It fails in the field, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. As an example, I've had compasses that stop working when I'm close to a turbine tower, so getting an azimuth is a problem. Rangefinders need batteries, so always have extras, but in general, you just want to make sure that you're checking your technology and that it's working properly before you head out in the field every day. I also want to put in a plug for submitting your reports and data to public databases, such as the American Wind Wildlife Institute or TETHIS. There are so many studies out there that haven't been made publicly available that could really help us to fill our data gaps. And the more that we know about these impacts, the better suited we are to manage for them. And I want to end with one of the more controversial questions surrounding Tier 4A monitoring studies, which is, should we monitor at every site? I hear the term monitoring to death or monitoring to monitor a lot these days. And the basic concept behind that is that a lot of money goes into these studies. If we have enough data in a particular region, wouldn't it be better to put that money towards research or impact reduction strategies that might actually help the species? And my answer is that it depends. In some places, we don't have enough information and we need these data. Some facilities have incidental take permits and they're required to quantify their impacts annually so that they can stay within their thresholds and for adaptive management purposes. In other cases, like when a facility is expanding and they have previous studies, then maybe monitoring isn't necessary. It is largely site specific, but I'd like to pose to the agencies that they be open to having these discussions when making recommendations for facilities. All right, so that is all the time that I have. I've listed here my contact information, so feel free to reach out through email or phone. And I want to thank NREL and Defenders for inviting me today. And now I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Amanda Hale from TCU.
Okay, so can you all see me and see my screen?
Yep, we can see your desktop.
Yep.
Okay, and then now is it just the presenter view?
Looks great.
Okay, all right, well, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be here today and for getting to talk to you about collecting and analyzing tissue samples from bats. Before I start, I am going to ask a trivia question. So which of these bats is a northern yellow bat, would you say? Is it A, B, C, or D?
Well, Amanda, it looks like people are a little bit unsure, but the top answer right now is C with 31%.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that and we'll come back to these images in about 10 minutes or so. Okay, so a lot of uncertainty. That sounds about right. Let me see if I can advance my screen. Okay, so today what I'd like to do is talk about collecting and analyzing tissue samples from bats. And the first question is really, why do we want to do this? Why should we spend time or money, effort on collecting these? And when I asked that question, I really thought of 4 answers. And I think the first is that by doing this, we can improve the quantity and quality of data that we're collecting from our standard post-construction fatality monitoring. The second reason is that from these samples, we can use population genetics or genomics approaches to estimate genetic diversity, determine if there's population structure, and then also monitor for population status and trends going forward in time. The third reason is that from these samples, particularly hair samples, we could identify the geographic origin of individual bats and potentially their migratory routes. And then last, these data can provide insights into why bats are active around wind turbines, which might help us come up with more effective strategies to minimize collision risk. And so collectively, the answers to all four of these questions will really help us determine the urgency and extent to which mitigation measures are necessary to sustain bat populations. So collecting bat carcasses, this is already standard procedure as part of a post-construction mortality monitoring effort. Carcasses, when they're found, are often removed from the field, and then some subset of those carcasses are used in bias trials. If there happen to be extra carcasses available on hand, these could be donated for research purposes, whether it to be to a college or university, a government research lab, or a museum. And the cost of this extra sort of collection really is minimal. We're talking about gloves to use safe handling procedures, and then Ziploc bags for storage. Typically, these carcasses are frozen. They're stored at minus 20 degrees Celsius, so just in a standard freezer is really all you need. If you are going to collect these carcasses and thinking about donating them for research, I would suggest that you prioritize fresh carcasses, so those that are less than 24 hours old and that are in excellent condition. And this is just going to maximize the different potential uses for these carcasses. They could be used to answer questions related to bat-wind turbine interactions, bat ecology, evolution, physiology, reproduction, diet, etc. And so really we could have this treasure trove here of information that can really improve our understanding of basic bat biology just through picking up these carcasses and donating them for research purposes. The other kind of collecting that we can talk about is bat tissue samples. Now, this would be an additional component to a standard post-construction mortality monitoring effort, but the additional effort is low in cost and really has a small time commitment. So it might just be an extra minute or two of processing time per carcass, and the supplies are really easy to acquire and not expensive. You can take tissue samples from carcasses that are going to be used in your bias trials, but you can also collect tissues from extra carcasses that you either don't want to store or handle in any other way. As with the whole carcasses, I would recommend prioritizing fresh carcasses that are in excellent condition, and particularly this is going to help ensure that you're going to get good quality DNA if that's one of the goals of collecting these samples. These tissue samples most often go toward studies related to genetics of bats and bat populations. Hair samples would go toward stable isotope studies looking at migration and movement in bats. And you could also use these samples for contaminant studies, say to look at mercury contamination in bats. You've got a way to sample it from these tissues. So if we're talking about the tissues that are most commonly collected, I'd say it's going to be wing membrane or other soft body tissue if the wings aren't present, or it's going to be hair clipped from between the shoulder blades. We're really talking about a small amount of tissue, so a wing membrane, a small 5 millimeter by 5 millimeter cut of tissue is sufficient. You just place it in a 1.5 milliliter tube filled with some preservative solution, like a 95 or 96% ethanol, and then it can be stored at room temperature and easily shipped off for genetic analyses. When we're talking about hair samples, again, it's a small area. Most studies, it's about clipping hair with scissors from a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter area between the shoulder blades, and then just simply putting that hair into a small plastic bag, and then it can be stored in a freezer if that's convenient with your other samples, or room temperature, and then sent off for analyses. If anybody would like more information on this, please feel free to contact me by email, and I'd be happy to send you sort of a detailed supplies list and collection protocols of what you would need. So the collection is quite simple, and then some of the analysis methods are quite complex. And so what I want to do with the remainder of our time is not walk through all of the details of a genetic analysis or a stable isotope analysis, but just highlight some of what we've learned from bat tissue samples first, and then from bat carcasses. And these are going to be examples from the peer-reviewed literature. And similarly, if you reach out to me by email, I'd be happy to send you copies of any of the papers that I'm going to share with you today. So the first reason why we should collect these carcasses or samples is it really does improve the quantity and quality of DNA we get from fatality monitoring. So we can use DNA extracted from these tissue samples to determine the sex of carcasses and also confirm or correct species identification, as Sarah mentioned earlier. So with respect to sex of carcasses, there were some previous studies reported a male bias sex ratio in migratory tree bats killed at wind energy facilities, and this is based on examining the carcasses on their external morphology. Well, recent studies in our lab and in Dave Nelson's lab have shown this isn't the case, at least for eastern red bats and hoary bats, where we see either a 50-50 sex ratio, males and females, or even a female bias in hoary bats. And so it's really important, if we want to understand the impacts of fatality on bats, we need to know which males or females are being killed and in what relative proportion. The other thing what we want to do in some cases is really confirm or correct our species identification. So this can be challenging when you've got decaying and scavenged carcasses, especially in locations where you've got morphologically similar species like those southern and northern yellow bats that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. And it's also important as wind energy development expands into new areas where maybe we don't have as good of understanding of the bat community in that location, or if the wind energy facility is within the range of a threatened or endangered species, and if it's particularly important to know if this take was of an Indiana bat or another Myota species. So in this paper shown here, Chips et al., they applied these techniques to a data set from wind energy projects down in far south Texas, where that star is located in the map, in the Rio Grande Valley. So the focus of this study was initially on documenting fatalities in southern and northern yellow bats. So the northern yellow bat is the top bat shown on the right over there. And we used a molecular method to determine sex, and what we found was a surprise. It turned out there was a female bias sex ratio in fatality of these yellow bats. And so what we don't know is this represent the population, and are there more adult females than males in this area? Or is there a difference in behavior? And is there something about female behavior that's putting them at greater risk of interacting with wind turbines? But these are some questions worth pursuing. The other thing that we wanted to do, because these northern and southern yellow bats are so similar, was use DNA barcoding to confirm or correct their species ID. And what we discovered in the data set was there weren't just 2 bats, there were 4. And so the bats on the bottom there, one is the western yellow bat and one is the western red bat, and both of these species were outside of their known geographic ranges. So in hindsight, it turned out to be quite important to sort of check our identification, because we had four species in our data set rather than just the 2. Okay. The second thing we can learn with these samples is we can use population genetics and genomics approaches to answer questions related to bat population status and trends. And this goes back to some of what Chris covered in the introduction, is that we simply don't have census population size estimates for these species. And so what we can then rely on instead is DNA from the tissue samples to help give us at least some perspective on what is happening with these species. We can estimate genetic diversity. We can estimate current and historical effective population size. We can detect bottlenecks, and we can also use these data to identify evolutionarily unique subpopulations or management units. And this could help us understand sort of the impact of mortality. So if we have unique subpopulations within a species, then maybe we might want to manage mortality in one region of the range differently than we would in another. And so this can be important information to have. This is one example of how this genetic data have been used to sort of get at these questions in migratory tree bats. So this is a paper by Sovic et al. Published in 2016, and it was the first study to use next generation sequencing on bat tissue samples from wind farms. And this is really important because the power of this next generation sequencing is that they genotype these bats at thousands of nuclear genetic loci, and so they had a lot of information to work with, which really helps them get better estimates of genetic diversity or to monitor effective population size through time. So they had this for the three bat species, eastern red hories and silverhairs. And what they found from this wind farm location in Ohio was no evidence of population structure for any of the species. So they looked like within eastern red bats, it was all one panmictic population with gene flow. And then all estimates of effective population size were large. And so effective population size, it's a parameter that's commonly estimated in conservation genetics. And so essentially it can be thought of as the size of an idealized population that would lose genetic diversity at the same rate as the actual population of interest. And so effective population size is almost always less than census size, but we can use it to look sort of back in time, many generations, to see what was sort of the historic size of this population, and then compare it to present times to current day effective population size. And then if we wanted to do genetic monitoring, we could then sort of track this, say, in 10 or 20-year intervals to see if we have evidence of decline in these species. And so what you see in these figures, these sort of upside down funnels, is the silver-haired bat is A, the hoary bat's in the middle of B, and the eastern red bat is C on the right. And the numbers outside the funnel at the top, that is the upper and lower limits of sort of a historical effective population size for each of these 3 species. And then the numbers down at the bottom inside those open funnels, those are estimates of the current effective population sizes. And so what the shape of these patterns indicate to us is that, one, it looks like in the recent past is that these species have all experienced range expansions and their populations have actually gotten bigger in time. And so that's interesting to know. But the other thing is if we're looking at what might be sort of the standing genetic diversity and among these 3 species, is a silver-haired bat has a smaller estimated effective population size today than does the hoary bat, which is also then smaller than the eastern red bat. And so it's just really good baseline information that we can use as a starting point for future monitoring of the impacts of wind on these 3 species. The third reason why we might want to do this is to identify geographic origins of individual bats and migratory routes. And so stable hydrogen isotope techniques are increasingly being used to answer these kinds of questions in a wide variety of animals, including migratory tree bats. What this approach relies on, though, is the presence of predictable continental scale patterns in stable hydrogen isotope composition of bat fur. And then what you can do is compare the composition of the bat fur to the composition of the precipitation across the geographic range of the species. And so for bats that are killed at wind farms, you can ask and answer the question, was the isotopic signature of the bat found at this location, is its fur compatible with this location? Does it look to be a local bat? Or does it have an isotopic signature that's discordant or doesn't match this location? And so a really nice example of using this with wind energy facility fatalities is by Pliant et al. In 2016. And they did this analysis for hoary bats and eastern red bats. And those stars in the maps there represent the wind farms where they sampled their bats in the Appalachian region. And what they found is that 1% of the hoary bat fatalities were from non-local sources. So most of the hoary bats included in their study had hair signatures that matched those locations, whereas 57% of the eastern red bat fatalities were from non-local sources. So it looks like if you think of these wind farms as sort of a catchment area for bats, it looks like the eastern red bats were coming from much larger areas than were the hoary bats in this study. So what can we learn from bat carcasses? I've just got a couple of quick examples there. I think we can learn a lot, and it provides insights into why bats are active around wind turbines and help us think about potential solutions to minimize this activity. So this is a paper by Cryan et al. From 2012, and they examined the reproductive anatomy of hoary bats, eastern reds, and silver hares found dead under wind turbines. And what they discovered was that males and females were mating ready and concluded that mating is a possible cause of tree bat fatality. So it provided some important information about sort of the timing of reproductive condition for these species that we didn't previously know. Another example is this paper by Fu et al. From 2017. And among other things, what they were interested in looking at was foraging activity of bats around wind turbines. And so they removed the stomachs from hoary bats and eastern red bats found in fatality searches. And what they discovered is that most of the stomachs were full or partially full, indicating that the bats were actively foraging just prior to the time of death. They then used DNA barcoding techniques to compare the prey items in the stomach contents of these bats to results from insect surveys at the wind turbines. And what they found is that the most abundant prey items in the stomachs of these bats were the insects that were commonly found at wind turbines. And so they concluded that foraging behavior is also a possible cause of tree bat fatalities. So these different causes obviously are not mutually exclusive. And then just as another side, it's not from a carcass necessarily, but what can we learn if we are from bat feces, right? So a signature that bats have been using an area. And so this last paper is by Bennett et al., published in 2017. And while setting up and doing standardized fatality searches, the research team noticed that there were bat fecal pellets on the turbine towers. And so they came up with the method of conducting systematic fecal surveys with each of those turbine tower searches, searching around the base of the tower, the stairs, the door, and the slats of the transformers. And what they discovered from this is that bats were roosting on the wind turbines, most likely as night roots between successive foraging bouts. And then this map here just shows each bar represents sort of which species of bat were found at which fecal samples from which species of bats were found at the different turbine towers. The red, it represents eastern red bat. And what you can see is that this species in particular seems to be at night roosting, hanging up on these towers on a regular basis across this wind energy facility. So again, this is just a nice example where if we take the time to look for evidence, we can gain important insights into what bats might be doing at these turbines and across facilities more broadly. And so just to wrap up quickly, collecting bat carcasses and tissue samples is not expensive or time consuming. And I would encourage many of you out there to think about how this might be done and how you could collaborate and increase what we know about bat ecology behavior and come up with good ways to minimize the risks to bats. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll pass it over to Matt.
Hello, can everyone hear and see my screen here?
Looks good, Matt. About to launch your polling question.
All right, my polling question here is how many tons of carbon dioxide were offset by wind energy in 2019?
It looks like the top answer at the moment is C, 20 million metric tons, and 50% of respondents chose that answer.
Oh, well, looks like I've stumped you. I still want to know Amanda's answer on the yellow bats, but in 2019, wind offsets 198 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's compared to 5 billion tons released each year by the U.S. and 35 of which comes from the energy industry. So, it also provided 7% of the country's electricity and offset the consumption of 103 billion gallons of water. So, in the interest of time, I'll just very quickly go through some slides here. Brief background on Avangrid. We're not always a household name. Our management like to think it is, but we're the third largest renewable developer in the U.S. And part of the largest owner-operated renewables in the world. Chris sort of broke down the history here, so I won't go through it in detail, but I think it's important to outline that the industry has a history of wildlife monitoring, often voluntary over the last 40 or so years. In the 80s and 90s, it was largely focused on birds, raptors first in California, passerines then larger, and then looking at population impacts as large-scale wind built out. In the kind of the 2000s era, after spending about 25 years or so focusing on birds, bat impacts began to get attention and study. First threatened endangered species bats were found at wind projects in the late 2000s, which focused the industry to explore advanced concepts like curtailments, technology like deterrence, misuse take permits. And then from the early 2010s on, the industry has been increasingly focused on migratory tree bats, which is noted, are 70% of the bat fatalities found at wind projects. The commitment to wildlife study was memorialized in the 2012 Wind Energy Guidelines, which was developed by multiple stakeholders, including government agencies, NGOs, and academia. Many companies like mine, Avangrid, conducts at least a year of intensive post-construction monitoring, regardless of a requirement to do so. But throughout this all, wind energy remains the only energy source that conducts large-scale monitoring of bats. Chris asked me to highlight some challenges, logistics, et cetera, that might not be fully understood when conducting wildlife studies of projects. I grouped them into sort of a pre and post construction topic area. I think land control is one of the big ones that applies to both pre and post construction. I mean, aside from the substation and O&M building, we don't own any of the land, not even the land underneath the turbines, and especially not the land around the turbines. We may not have rights to get that detector along your ideal repairing corridor. Along with a lack of land rights, wind is often the secondary use of the property. Farmers still plow, ranchers still raise livestock. equipment gets damaged, and it's also not unheard of the equipment goes missing. I'm convinced there's an eBay store for, anabats that fell off the truck. And then there's the uncertainty around the current way we do acoustics, among, the other things that Trevor mentioned. We still haven't solved if it's one bat flying past the detector 1,000 times or 1,000 bats echolocating just once. I think the other conclusion that's sometimes unfairly drawn is that pre-construction data is that presence equals risk. Just because you have a particular species in a misnet or a few thousand calls doesn't, of a few thousand calls doesn't mean you're going to find those fatalities. And unfortunately, it seems the opposite is true when you have sites that have no or low risk during pre-construction. Then you have unexpected fatalities during operation. And of course, there's still no good correlation between pre and post construction studies. And finally, acoustics have gotten better, better automated programs, qualitative analysis, but there's still a chance for false positives, especially when it comes to threatened endangered species where the bar is very low. Anything greater than 0 is a potential risk. The best example of this was the Beach Ridge ESA lawsuit in 2009-ish, when a court ordered a project in West Virginia to halt construction and to obtain an incidental take permit based on the potential risk to bats based solely on acoustics. And I think it can often be a difficult conversation when you have 100,000 bat calls at a project, and yet one or two of them is an Indiana bat, for example. And is that project likely to result in take? I'm going to minimize my webcam. From a post-construction standpoint, limited land control is still a significant factor. The landowner has to allow us to use cleared plots. Sometimes they don't understand the value of looking for dead things, as they say, in return for mowing down their valuable crops. And crop damage is something that the operator typically pays for, and these costs can be significant and increase exponentially with plot size, as kind of illustrated by this chart here. 120-meter cleared plot is 16 times larger than a 30-meter one at over 11 acres. We have projects that we pay more in crop damage to landowners than we do for study costs. And of course, even the most simplest post-construction study takes a significant coordination from a multidisciplinary team. And the logistical challenges of anything involving curtailment, cameras, or other technology, would be its own presentation. And bottom line, I think either way, the burden of better monitoring is often placed on the operator. Generally speaking, if you search less intensively, your area correction is high or your G is low, and the statistical calcs through the estimators, may give you a higher mathematical number. Alternatively, searching intensively gets to a number with narrower error bars, or to prove 0 takes tremendous resources. And so we're in a bit of a rock and hard place situation. And similarly, we often find that better projects, in other words, those with low bat numbers, are the most challenging to monitor or require the most efforts. Data collection and analysis is much easier when you have a large data set or a lot of dead bats, which is obviously not something we or anyone is looking for. And then I think while some level of monitoring is always going to be part of the wind industry for a long time, as it has over its history, it seems like the interplay between observation and conservation is becoming out of balance. And it's often said that everybody has a boss, but it's also true that everyone has a budget. And I suspect many of you are wildlife resource managers tasked to find the best conservation bang for your buck. And project budgets are not much different, as Sarah mentioned. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent monitoring wildlife at wind projects, observations. A paper presented at the last NWCC estimated that between 260 and 620 million were spent in the last decade on monitoring and research related to wildlife. By comparison, the Fed spends about $96 million a year towards the National Refuge Wildlife System. And simply put, resources going towards observation are then not available for conservation. Project budgets rely on long-term operations because the fuel is free, but upfront capital costs are significant. Wind also competes against other traditional energy sources. Companies like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, they aren't necessarily buying wind for the green cred. They're buying it because it's cheap and competitive with other types of energy. I'd love to know the life cycle impacts on bats of fuel extraction, refinement, transportation, generation, climate change causing emissions, et cetera, from fossil fuel forces. And the current paradigm of pre and post construction monitoring doesn't really answer the most important questions. As other speakers talked about, why do bats die? It seems like a fundamental question, but we have thermal imaging showing bats passing in and out of the rotor subzone multiple times without harm. We still don't know what time of night they died, specific meteorological conditions, et cetera. And meanwhile, the industry through the American Wind and Wildlife Institute has compiled, decades worth of observations in the AWIC database. For bats alone, we have, 210 PCM studies, 15,000 bat wind incidents. It's an incredible resource that's available for inquiry and study. But at what point does adding, another data point change conclusions? I think habitat conservation plans are, a good example of this lopsided balance. It's supposed to be an interplay between minimization, mitigation, and monitoring. It rarely seems to be the case anymore. This chart sort of shows the amount of dollars spent going towards mitigation versus monitoring, and you can see in most cases, monitoring is a factor of 3 or 4 times more resources than mitigation. And it seems that monitoring is becoming increasingly disincentivized. For one, the industry has been monitoring for the last 40 years in this sort of uncomfortable space of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, where every bird is a potential violation of a strict liability law and with civil and criminal penalties. You could have you could look for one thing and find another. You say you're looking for bats, you find a bald eagle, now you have a beekeeper problem. So you have to go into any monitoring effort for bats with eyes wide open. And finally, there seems to be an increasingly difficulty in accepting uncertainty as it relates to wildlife monitoring. But how do we know a problem, or to Chris's term, to know-ish? When the burden of proving certainty falls on the industry, it seems like there's no acceptance of uncertainty or weighted evidence approach. So going forward, I'm encouraged by the conversations that and the presentations of Trevor, Amanda, Sarah. This is the right direction to be taking things. I think it's important that we sort of rebalance the monitoring and conservation pieces. We answer the right questions, and to do that, we need kind of regulatory support to kind of do things a new way. Have we learned everything we can from AWIC? There's a lot of data in there that's ripe for study. Non-project monitoring. I think, monitoring of wind projects just, allows you to see bats in the area, those that are heard beforehand and die afterwards. And that may not be as important of a research question than understanding areas of the country we don't understand, where range, behaviors, and populations. NA-BAT is a great example of an exciting avenue that, if we could work it into monitoring requirements and get comfortable with the data use is a great option. Genetics, populations, all the things that Amanda talked about. Are we getting all the data from those carcasses that are often the most resource intensive thing to collect? We should be, if we're not. And then finally, looking forward, how else can we improve monitoring? Can we use drones to conduct mobile surveys to, solve is it 1 bat or 1,000 bat question? Can we use them to spot carcasses and dispatch biologists? Some companies like Avangrid, Pattern, they're using thermal cameras to better drill down on why and when bats die. And, researchers are already using artificial intelligence and neural networks to teach machines to spot large items like raptors. And I know, like, a lot of these things seem very far from the future, but so did ultrasonic acoustic deterrents, a decade ago, when we teamed with BCI to test them with glorified extension cords and Tupperware enclosures and holiday light timers. And now I think we should all find it exciting that, the next generation of those are commercially available and being deployed at wind projects. So, at the wire, thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks again to Trevor, Sarah, and Amanda. Clearly, there's a lot to talk about as we've gone over time, and we really don't have room for walking through questions with our speakers today, but we will follow up with written responses to the great questions that were submitted by many of you, as well as a few others we thought of that might add a little more information. So let me just close again by thanking our speakers and thanking all of you for attending this webinar today. And a reminder that we have our 5th webinar on Eagle scheduled for the 29th of September between 12 and 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll be announcing soon our day and times for the remaining webinars. If you have any questions, please send those to either Shana Steingard or Pasha Feinberg at Defenders. And thanks again for joining. Have a good day.